Tonight, we're not just telling ghost stories. We're traveling to Vietnam, a country with a history as rich and deep as its folklore. These aren't just tales whispered round a campfire. They're modern accounts from real people, in real places, stories that will make you think twice before you rent the charming old house for your next vacation. Story 1. Our first story takes us to the misty highlands of Dolat, a city known for its cool climate, pine forests, and French colonial architecture. For Nguyen Van Hai and his family, it was supposed to be a place of healing, but the house they chose held something else entirely. Hai's wife, Lathu Ha, had been struggling with stress, and he hoped the fresh mountain air would do her good. He rented a beautiful, isolated wooden house on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by a sea of pine trees and a near-constant blanket of fog. It was picturesque, peaceful, and deeply unsettling. The family Hai, their 12-year-old daughter Hyan and 9-year-old son Min settled in, unaware of what the coming nights would bring. The strangeness began on their very first night. Hyan came to her parents' room, her face pale with fear. She told them she'd seen a woman in a traditional white-out dye standing just outside her window. This would have been unnerving on its own, but Hyan's room was on the second floor, and it had no balcony. There was nowhere for anyone to stand. Hai and her tried to calm her down, dismissing it as a trick of the fog, her imagination running wild in a new, unfamiliar place. They told her it was just a dream, but it wasn't just Han. A few nights later, it was Min. He began waking up in the middle of the night, his small body rigid with terror. He would sit up in bed, pointing a trembling finger toward the darkest corner of his room, and whisper to his father, "Dad, she's here again." She asked if I wanted to play. Each time, I would search the room, finding nothing but shadows and the lingering scent of pine. The feeling that they were being watched, however, became impossible to ignore. Determined to find a rational explanation, I set up a small security camera in the living room, indirectly at the front door. He reviewed the footage the next morning, fast-forwarding through hours of stillness. Then he saw it. At around 3 a.m., the timestamp glowing in the corner of the screen, the heavy wooden door slowly creaked open all by itself. The camera showed no wind rustling the trees outside, no figure pushing it from the other side. It just opened into the foggy darkness, and silent invitation into their home. The worst night, the one that broke them, came exactly 1 week after they had arrived. Hai was jolted awake by a sound that made his blood run cold. The distinct thud of footsteps, running up and down the hallway just outside their bedroom. They were frantic. Heavy one moment and light the next. Grabbing a heavy flashlight, Hai cautiously opened his door. The hallway was empty, except for his daughter, Han. She was standing perfectly still at the far end, facing a dark corner, her head tilted at an angle that looked unnatural, almost painful. "Hyan," he whispered, his voice catching in his throat. She turned her head slowly, but the face that looked back at him wasn't entirely hers. Her eyes were vacant, and when she spoke, the voice that emerged was not the sweet, high-pitched voice of his 12-year-old daughter. It was deeper, colder, and filled with an ancient resentment. "This house is not yours." At that moment, Hao, who had followed Hai out, flipped on the living room lights. The sudden brightness flooded the hallway, and for a split, heart-stopping second, they all saw it. Standing in the main doorway, framed by the swirling fog outside, was the figure of a woman in a white-out dye. Her form was hazy, but her eyes were fixed directly on them, burning with an intensity that felt intense. And then, As quickly as she had appeared, she dissolved, fading into the mist like a puff of smoke. The next morning, there was no discussion. They packed their bags in silence, the unspoken terror hanging heavy in the air. I drove back to the landlord to return the keys, his hands still shaking. He didn't know what to say, how to explain why they were leaving so abruptly. But he didn't have to. The landlord took the keys, his expression unreadable, and said only one thing. The last person who lived there was a schoolteacher. She passed away in that same room your daughter slept in, story 2. For our second story, we head to the former imperial capital of Hue. This city, sitting on the banks of the Perfume River, is steeped in history and haunted by its past for a group of 5 friends. It was the perfect setting for a bit of urban exploration, but they would soon learn that some places are abandoned for a reason. Phan Trong Cang, Vu Hai Nam, Lin, Now, and Dat were young, adventurous, and maybe a little reckless. They had heard local rumors about an old, derelict house on the river, a place where people claimed to see strange lights and the silhouette of someone standing behind the curtains, intrigued. They decided to go there at night and film their adventure, hoping to capture something spooky for social media. As they pushed open the rotting door, a wave of cold, damp air hit them. The house smelled of mold, decay, and stagnant water. It was pitch black inside. When Nam switched on his powerful flashlight, the beam cut through the darkness, landing on an old family altar against the far wall. On it sat a single, faded portrait of a man. His face was stern, but what was truly chilling was that someone had taken a piece of black charcoal and violently scratched out his eyes. Dat, ever the skeptic, laughed it off as a prank by other explorers, but as his laughter echoed in the dead quiet house, Lin suddenly froze. She felt an icy breath against her ear, followed by a faint, urgent whisper that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. "Don't stay here." She spun around, but there was no one there. Ignoring her pleas to leave, Nam decided to explore the second floor. The wooden staircase groaned under his weight. At the top, he found a long, dark hallway. His flashlight beam revealed something bizarre. The floor was covered in a thin layer of dust and grime, and preserved in it were muddy footprints. They led from the top of the stairs all the way down the hall, but they didn't lead into a room or turn a corner. The footprints went straight into the solid back wall and simply stopped. Downstairs, Kang had started a live stream on his phone, narrating their creepy adventure to his followers. As he panned the camera around the room, a comment popped up on the screen, sending a jolt of fear through him. A viewer had written, "Who's that standing behind your friend?" Kang looked up. The comment was referring to Dat, who was standing just a few feet away. Dat turned round, his eyes wide. There was nobody there. The space behind him was empty. They might have brushed it off as an internet troll, but their curiosity got the better of them. They stopped the stream and immediately replayed the last few seconds of the clip. And there, clear as day on the small screen, was the figure of a tall, thin man standing directly behind Dat. He had one hand placed firmly on Dat's shoulder, but the most horrifying part was his face. It was a complete blank, a smooth, featureless oval of skin, no eyes, no mouth, no nose. It was like his face had been erased. Panic erupted. The friends scrambled over each other, screaming as they fled the house and burst back out into the night air. As they sprinted away, Doris the final glance back. Her heart stopped. Pressed against the glass of a second-floor window was that same horrifying, erased face, watching them go. The terror didn't end when they left the house. For the next several nights, Kang was tormented in his own home. He would be lying in bed when he'd hear it. 3 distinct knocks on his bedroom door. Knock. Knock. Every time. He'd creep to the door and look through the peephole, only to find the hallway empty. But as he stood there, peering into nothing, he could hear the unmistakable sound of someone breathing, wet and ragged, right beside his ear. They never went back to that house again. Story 3. Our final account comes from Can Tho, the bustling heart of the Mekong Delta. It's a city of floating markets, winding canals, and a vibrant nightlife. For a young couple named Tran Minh Phuc and Nguyen Jamai, it was meant to be a romantic stop on their travels. The cheap rental room they found near the famous Ninh Kieu Wharf seemed too good to be true. And it was. The price was incredibly low for its prime location, which should have been their first red flag. When they met the landlady to get the key, she gave them a warning that was both specific and deeply unsettling. She looked them both in the eye and said, "At night, don't open the window. And whatever happens, don't answer if someone calls your name." Phuc and Mai just smiled and nodded, laughing it off as the quirky superstition of an old woman. They would soon regret not taking her seriously. That night, at round midnight, Mai was awakened by a soft tapping sound. Cock, 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 it was coming from the window. Phuc, annoyed, got up to check. He pulled back the curtain and looked out into the dark alley. There was nothing there. He secured the latch and went back to bed, telling Mai it was probably just a tree branch. But a few minutes later, the knocking came again, louder and more insistent this time. And then, a woman's voice, a soft and pleading whisper, drifted through the glass. "Mai, open the window for me." Mai scrambled away from the window, her heart pounding in her chest. The voice had known her name. Phuc, now genuinely scared, ripped the curtain aside again. The alley was still empty. There was no one there. They double-checked the lock and huddled together in bed. Sleep now an impossibility. They must have drifted off eventually, because at 3 a.m., Phuc was jolted awake by a new sound, the slow, rhythmic dripping of water. He reached over and turned on the bedside lamp. His eyes followed the sound up to the ceiling. A dark, thick, reddish-brown liquid was dripping from a crack in the plaster, splattering onto the floorboards. As his eyes adjusted to the light, Mai let out a blood-curdling scream. In the far corner of the room, a figure was standing. It was a woman, bent completely forward at the waist, her hands touching the floor and her long, wet hair obscuring her face. As they watched in frozen horror, she began to slowly, and naturally, lift her head. But what was underneath the curtain of hair wasn't a human face. It was a burnt, scorched, pitch-black void. 2 empty sockets where her eyes should have been. The lipless hole that was her mouth opened, and she whispered in a voice like dragging stones, "Give it back." The couple didn't wait to hear more. They flew out of the room and down the stairs, their screams echoing through the silent guest house. At the bottom of the stairs, the landlady was waiting. She was sitting in a chair, a cup of tea in her hands, as if she had been expecting them. She wasn't surprised or alarmed. She just looked at their terrified faces and said calmly, "A woman drowned in that room years ago. She lost her eyes, and she still thinks they're here." Phuc and Mai left before the sun was even up. They didn't ask for their money back. They just got as far away from that place as they could, vowing to never again stay in a cheap and vetted rental. 3 different cities, 3 different houses, but one terrifying truth. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. It waits. It watches. And sometimes when you're a guest in its home. It makes itself known. So the next time you hear a strange noise in the night, just remember these stories. And whatever you do, don't open the door. And don't answer if someone calls your name.